Hello, my dear friends. People still think Victorian women were pampered like goddesses, but few know that they were abandoned, bleeding, and curled up in mouldy sheets after each lovemaking session. The intimacy was not gentle but hard, painful, and completely one-sided. No towels, no questions, just fishy smells and gasps. They had no choice, no touching in the way they wanted. Tonight, we will lift the velvet curtain and step into the corrupted world of Victorian sex. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now just dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to step quietly into the bedroom of an ordinary Victorian couple, the first thing to notice would not be romance, but the smell. It was heavy, damp, and strangely sweet, clinging to every corner of the room. The bed, wide enough for two but rarely aired, was layered with sheets that had not been changed for weeks. In homes where washing took effort, water was cold and privacy was scarce. The idea of fresh bedding was a luxury. Families waited until the stench became unbearable before stripping the bed. Until then, life went on, and so did intimacy. It is almost absurd to think that love was often expressed on a surface so filthy it could have served as a breeding ground for disease. The sheets were not simply stained, they were record books of nights long past. Each mark told of sweat, blood, and other bodily traces left to dry where they fell. Men returned home from work with coal dust on their skin and oil under their nails, collapsing into bed without washing. Women, exhausted from housework and childbearing, lay beside them because it was expected. Between them, the mingled odours of iron, musk, and mildew formed a kind of nightly fog. What seemed to the outside world a respectable union was, in private, an unwashed tangle of flesh and residue. For poorer households, washing bed linens was nearly impossible. Water had to be fetched, boiled, and carried up narrow stairs. Soap was costly, and drying sheets in the cold air took days. In cities thick with soot, clean laundry did not stay clean for long, so couples made peace with the grime. Blankets grew stiff from layers of dried fluids, the texture changing from cloth to crust. When the night came, they lay back on the same patches, unbothered or simply resigned. If we imagine this through modern eyes, it would be like sleeping every night on a towel used after surgery and never once replaced. The body adapted in strange ways. Skin stuck to fabric during summer, peeled away in winter, and infections found easy homes in the damp folds of cloth. Some women developed sores that never healed properly. Others learned to sleep in positions that avoided certain parts of the bed altogether. There was no concept of bacteria, no understanding of hygiene beyond what the nose could detect. Cleanliness was about smell, not science. If something no longer stank, it was considered safe. The mixture of dried sweat, menstrual blood, and semen created a film that trapped dust and insects. Fleas thrived, bedbugs multiplied, and small welts covered the skin of those who slept there. Many blamed these irritations on the air or on fate. In truth, they were sleeping each night in a microcosm of decay. Yet even this was not unusual. In a society that prized appearances, dirt in private spaces was invisible. The parlour might gleam, the curtains might be freshly pressed, but the bed was a silent contradiction, both the centre of respectability and its quiet undoing. Intimacy in such conditions was more duty than pleasure. Women were taught to endure, to lie still, to fulfil what was seen as a wife's responsibility. Their comfort or desire mattered little. Husbands climbed into bed without thinking of cleanliness or consequence. The act itself was mechanical, performed on sheets hardened by residue. In the dark, the rough fabric scraped against skin already irritated. Some described it later as feeling more like an illness than an affection. I can almost picture the scene and feel a quiet pity, not for the filth itself, but for how little anyone seemed to question it. The combination of filth and repetition turned beds into repositories of disease. Urinary infections, skin rashes, and even fevers often began here. Yet when sickness spread, few connected it to the bed. Doctors spoke of bad air, poor diets, or weak constitutions. They did not think to ask when the sheets were last washed. A clean bed was an idea reserved for the rich, those who could afford servants to do the labour. For everyone else, intimacy and infection were simply parts of the same life. Sometimes, women tried to clean only the visible parts. They rubbed the stains with water or vinegar, creating pale halos on the fabric that looked cleaner than they were. But the deeper residue stayed, seeping into the stuffing beneath. Over time, the mattress itself became heavy with moisture and mould. Lying down meant sinking into years of trapped breath and body heat. The smell could cling to skin for hours after leaving the bed. Still, each night, the ritual continued. To those who lived through it, this routine was not shocking. It was ordinary, just as factory smoke blackened lungs and river water spread cholera. The unwashed bed was another hazard folded into daily life. Survival meant endurance. Cleanliness was not moral. Endurance was. Women carried that belief like a badge, convinced that suffering quietly was the mark of a good wife. The home remained outwardly proper, but beneath its layers, everything was rotting slowly. The irony of Victorian morality was that it worshipped purity while ignoring what purity truly meant. A clean soul mattered more than a clean body. To scrub sheets would have seemed frivolous compared to scrubbing sin. So the bed, that private altar of love and reproduction, became instead a place of slow decay. It is difficult not to wonder how many lives were shortened by such simple neglect. At its core, this story of dirty sheets reveals more than just poor hygiene. It exposes the gap between ideals and reality, between the appearance of virtue and the quiet suffering that upheld it. Love in the Victorian home was often buried beneath layers of unwashed fabric, matted hair, and silent obedience. The people who lived in those beds may have believed themselves moral, but their bodies told another truth. The marriage bed, meant to unite two souls, instead became a vessel that preserved their waste and their weariness. It was not cleaned, but used again and again, until the fabric carried years of hidden stories. It is hard to separate disgust from pity when thinking of those rooms, where affection met decay and habit replaced tenderness. The nightly ritual on those stained sheets was both ordinary and grotesque, a quiet reflection of the times. From that mixture of sweat and indifference came more than discomfort. It carried the seeds of deeper pain yet to unfold. In another room, on another night, the neglect would take a different form, one that reached far beyond the sheets and into the very body itself. Intimacy in the Victorian home often began when the day had already worn the body down. Men returned from the streets or factories, their shirts damp with sweat and dust from long hours of labour. Women finished their chores with hands rough from scrubbing, their hair clinging to their necks in the heat of stoves and cramped rooms. When night arrived, there was no thought of bathing, no pause for cleansing. The body was used as it was, covered in the residue of the day. Water was too precious, and heating it was too troublesome. So cleanliness waited for another time that rarely came. It seems almost laughable now that people believed passion could thrive beneath layers of grime, yet for Victorians, this was simply how life was lived. There was a kind of practicality behind the neglect. For most, bathing was a weekly task at best, done quickly and modestly, often in the kitchen with a small tin tub. Warm water was reserved for the children or the sick. Adults used cold water, if any at all, splashing only the face and hands. To immerse the whole body was seen as excessive, even suspicious, as if too much attention to the flesh might suggest moral looseness. The idea of washing before or after intimacy did not exist in common practice. The act itself was considered natural, not something to be prepared for or recovered from. Cleanliness belonged to the daylight hours, while the night held its own quiet decay. The air in the room after such encounters grew heavy and sharp. Sweat, breath, and secretions mingled into a film that settled on the sheets and skin alike. Most couples simply pulled their clothes back on and fell asleep. In the morning, the scent still lingered, a faint sourness that clung to fabric and hair. Some women tried to wipe themselves with old cloths or corners of the sheet, but that only spread the residue further. Few saw this as a problem. To them, discomfort was part of the experience. If we think of this in modern terms, it would be like finishing a workout in a crowded gym and then sleeping all night in the same clothes without washing. The notion of post-intimacy hygiene was foreign. Soap, even when available, was harsh and expensive. Many feared that washing the genitals could cause illness or weaken the body. Doctors warned against excessive bathing, claiming it could upset the balance of humours or lead to infertility. These ideas blended with moral restraint to create a society where filth was tolerated as virtue. A clean body was not associated with purity, but with vanity. To be modest meant to ignore the body as much as possible, even when it cried out for care. The results were predictable. Women developed infections that burned and lingered, their bodies reacting to the constant exposure to bacteria and stale fluids. Men suffered as well, though fewer admitted it. The smell of sweat mixed with the musty scent of unwashed linen until it became a kind of background noise of marriage. No one complained openly. To speak of such things was indecent. The silence around hygiene was as thick as the air in those small, unventilated rooms. I find it strange how something so simple as a basin of water could have spared so much discomfort, yet pride and ignorance kept it out of reach. There was a deeper irony in how Victorians viewed cleanliness. They prized order and respectability, yet their most private acts were shrouded in filth. The same hands that polished the silverware or dusted the piano keys each morning would later touch bodies without once being washed. The contrast was striking, but invisible to those who lived it. The mind separated the cleanliness of the home from the cleanliness of the flesh, as if morality could compensate for neglect. When illness appeared, they blamed the weather, the air, or divine punishment, but never the dirt on their own skin. Within marriage, intimacy had little to do with affection or care. It was an obligation carried out with minimal thought. There were no baths drawn to set the mood, no moments of tenderness afterward. A woman might lie still, her hair damp with sweat, while her husband turned away to sleep. In the morning, both dressed and went about their routines as if nothing had happened. The body's needs were ignored, reduced to a tool for duty and reproduction. Water, the simplest relief, remained untouched in its bucket, cooling overnight beside the bed. Occasionally, in wealthier households, couples had access to larger bathtubs or attendants who could prepare warm water. Yet even among the upper class, bathing was not tied to intimacy. Perfume and powder masked odours more often than washing removed them. Scented oils were dabbed on wrists and necks to disguise the stale smell of bodies that had not seen soap in days. The appearance of refinement mattered more than the truth beneath it. To be clean in public was enough. What happened behind closed doors was invisible and therefore unimportant. For poorer couples, the situation was far worse. Living in crowded tenements with no private water supply, they shared basins and towels with other families. Bathing together was impossible, and privacy was non-existent. A husband might return home reeking of smoke and sweat, and his wife, too tired to protest, would accept his touch in silence. There was no expectation of comfort, only survival. The cycle of work, grime, and fatigue repeated endlessly, broken only by sleep or illness. This neglect of the body mirrored the neglect of emotion. The act of union was stripped of tenderness, leaving only function. To wash was to care, and care was a language few spoke aloud. The dirt became part of the ritual, a shared burden of endurance, the smell, the stickiness, the fatigue. All of it formed the texture of married life. It was not romantic, but it was normal. And within that normality lay the quiet tragedy of a society that mistook repression for virtue. In the stillness of those dark rooms, where bodies cooled without cleansing, disease found easy ground. The very air carried reminders of what had passed. No one looked back. No one thought to wash away the remains of the night. What lingered on skin and fabric was simply life continuing as it always had. The lingering scent of sweat and skin spoke of how little care people gave to their own bodies. The habit of treating filth as normal turned intimacy into something mechanical rather than human. Yet when they tried to hide that stench with perfume, another danger quietly began to take shape. Perfume was a mark of refinement in the Victorian age, a symbol of grace that promised to mask the unpleasant realities of daily life. In crowded towns and dimly lit bedrooms, scent became a substitute for cleanliness. When water was scarce and bathing was considered troublesome, fragrance offered an illusion of purity. Bottles of rose, lavender, or musk sat proudly on dressing tables beside combs and mirrors. For many women, these bottles felt like protection, a way to appear elegant even when the body was not. It is almost comical to think about how the Victorians fought decay, not with soap and water, but with the hope that a stronger smell could defeat a bad one. Perfume in the Victorian world was not delicate. It was thick, heavy, and overwhelming. The air of a room filled with it would sting the nose and linger for hours. The formulas were crude, often mixed with alcohol and animal fats. Applied sparingly, they clung to skin and cloth alike. But some women, desperate to appear fragrant in every sense, began to use it more boldly. Without knowledge of irritation or infection, they applied perfume directly to the most private parts of the body. The intention was to seem desirable, to conceal any trace of sweat or intimacy. What began as vanity soon became pain. After intercourse, when the skin was sensitive and the body raw, perfume offered a false solution. The sharp sting was mistaken for freshness, the burning for cleanliness. In truth, the alcohol and oils caused small wounds that refused to heal. Women whispered of soreness and burning sensations, but few dared to speak plainly. The matter was too shameful to mention. Their husbands rarely noticed, or if they did, they attributed the discomfort to female weakness. If we were to imagine this today, it would be like using household disinfectant instead of soap and calling it luxury skin care. Advertisements at the time did little to discourage the practice. Perfume makers claimed their products could restore purity or invigorate the senses. The language was seductive, and it preyed upon insecurity. In a society obsessed with appearances, a woman's worth was tied to her scent. To smell pleasant was to appear virtuous, clean, and refined. To smell of sweat or the human body was indecent. So they poured, dabbed, and rubbed until fragrance replaced flesh. The ingredients themselves were dangerous. Alcohol dried the skin. Animal musk caused inflammation, and oils extracted with crude solvents carried traces of toxins. The labels gave no warnings. There were no safety standards, no medical advice, only endless suggestions that a woman's fragrance defined her character. The irony was cruel. The same culture that demanded chastity also demanded allure, leaving women trapped between purity and pain. To smell alluring meant risking injury, yet to ignore it meant appearing vulgar. Behind closed doors, the act of applying perfume became a ritual. A few drops on the wrist, a touch at the neck, then a hidden gesture beneath layers of lace and cotton. It was done quickly, quietly, as if scent could erase shame. The perfume did not cleanse, it only musked. Over time, the delicate skin broke, blistered, and scarred. The faint sweetness of lavender mingled with the sharp scent of infection. Yet few sought help. Doctors were men, and such subjects were unfit for discussion. Suffering in silence was easier than humiliation. I cannot help but think how tragedy often hides behind the most elegant gestures, and how ignorance can turn vanity into torment. Perfume became both shield and weapon. It disguised the truth of bodies that rarely bathed, yet it punished those who used it most. The burning was taken as a sign of effectiveness, the pain a necessary sacrifice for beauty. Some even believed the sting proved purity, that discomfort was the price of being presentable. The misunderstanding was cultural, almost religious, rooted in the belief that the body itself was something to conquer rather than care for. The manufacturers profited easily. Their products were cheap to make and endlessly marketable. The stronger the scent, the more refined it was considered. A few reformers warned of harm, but their voices were small and easily ignored. The Victorian obsession with appearances drowned them out. People preferred illusion to truth. To acknowledge the danger would have meant questioning not just perfume, but the entire system that demanded it. In the stillness of the bedroom, when the act was done and the perfume bottle stood open on the table, the air grew thick again. The scent was meant to cover the residue of sweat and skin, yet it only mixed with it, forming a cloud both sweet and rancid. What lingered was not seduction, but suffocation. Those who lived through it learned to mistake that smell for normalcy. It was the odour of repression dressed as refinement. Fragrance became a language of denial. It told of lives polished on the surface but raw underneath. In the end, the perfume bottles that glimmered so proudly on Victorian vanities were not symbols of beauty, but silent reminders of how far people would go to appear clean without ever being so. The burning scent that once promised purity became another form of decay. It spoke of women trapped between cleanliness and pain, of a society that valued scent over safety. Yet beyond that veil of fragrance, a darker ritual was waiting, one that no amount of perfume could disguise. It was not about scent anymore, but about touch, and the false cure that turned medicine into violation. In the moral order of the Victorian household, marriage was not built on affection but on obligation. The man was the head, the woman the vessel of duty. What happened in the privacy of their bedroom was governed not by desire but by expectation. When a husband reached for his wife, she was not asked whether she wanted him. Her answer had already been given the day she married. Consent was no longer hers to give or withhold. It is bitterly ironic that a society obsessed with virtue found righteousness in acts that ignored the will of its women. A woman's body was considered property, an extension of her husband's rights. Religious sermons spoke of wifely obedience. Medical texts described female reluctance as a natural modesty that must be overcome. Even illness was no refuge. Fever, pain, or exhaustion did not excuse her from duty. Husbands were told that marital rights were God-given, and that resistance was sin. To refuse was rebellion. To endure was piety. The home, celebrated as a sacred space, often became a private battlefield of submission. Many of these women were not fully conscious when it happened. Some lay in bed with headaches from the smoke-filled air, their bodies aching from childbirth or menstruation. Others were asleep when their husbands returned from work, smelling of beer and dust. The act was performed in silence, without tenderness, as routine as locking the door. Women learned to lie still, to breathe evenly, to let it end quickly. If we were to translate this into modern terms, it would be like being punished for not smiling while enduring pain you never agreed to. No law recognized what they endured as of their isolation. The concept of rape within marriage simply did not exist. A husband could not commit such an act against what was legally his. Courts upheld this belief for decades, claiming that by marrying, a woman gave permanent consent. The idea of her body belonging to herself was foreign, even scandalous. The silence surrounding these acts was reinforced by religion, medicine, and social hierarchy. To speak of them was unthinkable. To question them was dangerous. Some women broke under the weight of this obedience. They suffered chronic pain, infections, and bleeding. But these symptoms were dismissed as hysteria or weakness. Doctors prescribed rest, tonics, or prayer. The emotional wounds were deeper still. Nights blurred into one another. A cycle of submission repeated until the body ceased to feel. The mind withdrew to survive, leaving only emptiness behind. I often wonder how many Victorian women lived entire lives without once being asked what they desired, only what they could endure. The hypocrisy of the age was suffocating. In public, women were celebrated as angels of the home, pure and nurturing. In private, they were expected to submit without question. A good wife suffered quietly. The act itself was stripped of pleasure, reduced to ritual. Husbands were encouraged to perform their duty as proof of virility, and wives to receive it as proof of virtue. Intimacy became a transaction of power disguised as morality. It is difficult to picture how common this was. Letters and diaries rarely mention it, but between the lines, the silence speaks loudly. Women wrote of sleepless nights, of exhaustion, of vague marital discomforts. These were polite phrases for a truth they could not name. Even among friends, such topics were avoided. The pain was private, sealed behind lace curtains and polite smiles. When a woman became pregnant soon after a miscarriage or during illness, it was not seen as cruelty, but as the natural course of marriage. Her suffering was her duty, her body the instrument of family and faith. Those who protested risked social ruin. They were called ungrateful, hysterical, or even immoral. The same society that condemned public indecency quietly sanctioned violence in the bedroom. To be a wife was to serve. To be silent was to survive. The lack of understanding about women's health made it worse. Without knowledge of infection or trauma, husbands believed their actions harmless. They thought themselves dutiful, even kind, when they fulfilled their role. Pain was taken as evidence of purity, and indifference as virtue. The moral framework that ruled their lives taught that the body existed for service, not for self. There was no vocabulary for violation, only endurance. The church reinforced the cycle. Sermons spoke of marriage as sacred, of wives submitting as Christ submitted to suffering. Scripture was twisted into justification for domination. The confessional offered no comfort, only the reminder that obedience was holy. Women prayed for strength, not freedom. Some numbed themselves with laudanum or alcohol, seeking sleep they could not otherwise find. The nights that followed were filled with repetition, the slow erosion of will beneath the weight of duty. In the cold logic of Victorian society, what mattered most was appearances. So long as the household seemed peaceful, no one cared what happened behind closed doors. Men boasted of discipline and self-control, yet claimed control of others as their right. Women were praised for gentleness, yet expected to bear cruelty without complaint. Beneath the facade of respectability, the domestic sphere concealed an unspoken violence, one too ordinary to provoke outrage. The tragedy of it all lies in how normal it became. Marital obedience was praised as love, silence mistaken for harmony. The emotional distance between partners grew wider with each unspoken night. What should have been a connection became a ritual of absence. It was not romance, but repetition, not affection, but ownership. And still, society called it virtue. Each unspoken night left behind more than pain. It built a foundation of quiet resentment, of bodies used but never seen, of souls kept alive only by habit. This was the hidden cost of Victorian morality, the suffering made invisible by its own rules. The image of devotion that Victorians cherished was never pure. It was stained by submission, by the quiet suffering of countless women whose names history forgot. They were called dutiful wives, though what they truly were was unseen witnesses to their own erasure. In that silence, another practice was waiting, one that turned supposed healing into humiliation and blurred the line between medicine and violation. In the dim light of Victorian bedrooms, men approached their wives with hands that carried the dirt of the entire day. Those hands had turned doorknobs sticky with soot, grasped coins slick with other people's sweat, and sometimes wiped themselves after relieving their bowels without a thought for soap or water. When night came, they reached out again, this time not for work but for touch. The same fingers that held tools and cleaned boots slipped beneath the sheets, as if nothing about them could harm. It is almost absurd to think that the same society that prized polished shoes cared nothing for clean hands when touching a human body. Cleanliness in Victorian England was a matter of display, not of intimacy. Men washed their faces in the morning and combed their hair, but washing their hands beyond that was unnecessary in their minds. The idea that unseen dirt could cause harm was foreign to them. Germ theory was still young, and many dismissed it as superstition. What could not be seen could not be feared. A husband might return from work with grime packed beneath his nails, sit down to dinner, and then go to bed without once touching a basin of water. The boundary between the filth of the street and the sanctity of the home was only an illusion. The result of this ignorance was predictable. Women suffered quietly from infections that doctors could not explain. Burning pain, fever, and discharge became common, and yet few connected them to the nightly ritual of unwashed hands. Husbands assumed their wives were weak, fragile, or sickly by nature. Some even accused them of being unclean, unaware that the cause of their suffering came from the dirt they themselves carried. If we imagine this now, it would be like a surgeon walking from the stables straight into the operating room, proud of his discipline but blind to his own contamination. Soap was available, but not respected. To many men, washing was feminine, unnecessary, even effeminate. They believed that a real man's strength came from labour, from dirt earned through effort. The stains on their hands were marks of pride, not warning signs. Bathing before touching their wives would have seemed laughable. Cleanliness was for women and servants. Masculinity, they thought, had no use for water. Some wives tried to insist on washing. They brought bowls of warm water to the bedside, but their husbands brushed them aside. Such gestures were considered silly or insulting, as though a man could be tainted by his own labour. Women were taught not to argue, not to spoil the mood of the marital duty. They endured instead, letting the ritual unfold while their bodies bore the consequences. Doctors saw the aftermath, fever, infection, and inflammation, but treated symptoms rather than the cause. They prescribed rest or tonics, rarely suspecting the obvious. Within the narrow confines of Victorian morality, the male body was considered pure by default. A man's work, his sweat, even his filth, were signs of vitality. The female body, by contrast, was seen as delicate and prone to corruption. Thus, when an infection appeared, it was always the woman's fault. The imbalance was moral as much as physical. She was expected to stay clean, though her husband never did. I cannot help but feel a grim irony in how men of that time worshipped the idea of purity while spreading disease with their own touch. Even the emerging field of medicine offered little help. Many doctors dismissed the notion that washing could prevent illness, calling it unnecessary or unmanly. Hospitals reeked of death because surgeons operated without gloves, their hands unwashed between patients. If professionals refused to cleanse, what chance did ordinary men have of understanding hygiene was an afterthought, and women's suffering remained invisible behind the curtain of ignorance? The intimacy between husband and wife was stripped of gentleness. It was not touch born of affection, but of habit. The hands that gripped tools and horses' reins were the same that explored the most sensitive parts of another body. The friction of dirt against skin caused tiny tears, each one an open door for infection. Pain became part of the routine. Some women lived with a constant ache, their nights marked by discomfort they could never name aloud. To speak of such things was indecent, to question a husband's behaviour unthinkable. Even among the upper class, where perfumed gloves and handkerchiefs were common, the illusion of cleanliness persisted. A gentleman might smell of cologne and carry a silver-topped cane, yet his nails hid the grime of tobacco and street dust. The outward elegance only deepened the hypocrisy. Appearances were sacred, truth irrelevant. A spotless collar mattered more than a clean conscience, and behind those polished appearances, infections festered unseen, rotting away the quiet dignity of married life. The damage extended beyond the physical. Each careless touch reinforced a hierarchy where women's bodies existed for use, not for care. The neglect was not cruelty by intention, but by indifference. Men had never been taught to think of cleanliness as respect. To them, intimacy was another chore completed before sleep, another proof of authority. The idea that tenderness could mean washing one's hands first would have seemed laughable. As time went on, medical understanding began to change. The notion that invisible agents cause disease slowly gained ground. But for countless women, this came too late. The infections they endured left lasting damage, infertility, chronic pain, and even death. The stains of ignorance did not wash away easily, either from skin or from history. What remained was a legacy of neglect disguised as normalcy. The act of touch without care left women suffering in silence long after the lights went out. The idea of hygiene had never reached the realm of affection, leaving tenderness replaced by habit. Yet the pain of neglect would soon deepen, not from filth alone, but from the absence of compassion itself. In the quiet of the Victorian bedroom, a woman's silence was more valued than her pleasure. From the moment she married, she was taught that a respectable wife did not move, did not speak, did not feel too much. The body was a duty, not a source of joy. To close her eyes and remain still was a sign of virtue. To express desire was shameful. In a world ruled by appearances, even passion had to wear a mask. It is strange to think that a civilization so proud of refinement saw stillness in bed as the height of female decency. The rules of intimacy were shaped by fear and hypocrisy. Victorian society demanded chastity from women and indulgence from men. A woman's virtue was measured not by her happiness but by her restraint. She was expected to lie quietly, to let the act happen to her rather than take part in it. A good wife endured without sound. The smallest sign of pleasure could be taken as corruption, as if her body's natural response was evidence of moral failure. Many learned to hide their breath, to bite their lips, to pretend they felt nothing at all. Men were raised to believe that desire belonged only to them. The female body existed for their use and for reproduction. They saw themselves as protectors, even while they ignored the harm they caused. Intimacy was a task to be completed, not a connection to be shared. Few paused to wonder what their wives felt, or whether they felt anything at all. If this were translated into today's world, it would be like expecting someone to smile while living without air, pretending comfort inside suffocation. The medical establishment reinforced this cruelty. Doctors declared that women were naturally passive, incapable of real sexual feeling. Any sign of arousal was pathologized as hysteria. They wrote that a woman's pleasure was irrelevant, sometimes even dangerous. To seek it was to risk madness. These ideas spread quickly through polite society, teaching women to distrust their own sensations. The body became an enemy that had to be controlled. Even the smallest expression of emotion was trained out of them, replaced by a practiced calm that hid exhaustion and fear. This emotional repression left scars that were never visible. Nights were filled with anxiety, not anticipation. Some women lay awake long after their husbands slept, their minds circling the dread of the next demand. The body tightened against touch, preparing for what could not be refused. The silence that followed each encounter was heavy, filled with unspoken shame. The language of affection became mechanical movements repeated without meaning. I find it haunting how easily cruelty can disguise itself as respect when silence is mistaken for virtue. In wealthier homes, the same rules applied behind layers of luxury. Perfumed sheets and soft lighting could not change the emptiness of the act. Women wore fine nightgowns and jewelled hairpins, yet the expectations were the same. They were to appear modest, obedient, and quiet. To take the initiative would ruin their reputation. Their husbands might speak tenderly in public, but in private, love was defined by control. The unspoken message was clear: a pure woman did not enjoy herself. Among the poor, silence was not only social but practical. Thin walls and crowded rooms meant every sound could be overheard. Women learned to suppress their voices out of necessity, pressing their faces into pillows to hide the noise of pain or humiliation. In such spaces, the line between decency and survival blurred completely. Pleasure was not even a thought. It was a luxury far beyond reach. The consequences of this conditioning lasted far beyond the act itself. Women grew fearful of their own bodies, ashamed of natural instincts they could not erase. Some avoided intimacy altogether, feigning illness or exhaustion. Others accepted their fate, treating each night as a duty. The connection between affection and touch broke entirely. The home that should have been a refuge became a place of quiet dread. Victorian men, meanwhile, mistook this stillness for satisfaction. They believed silence meant consent, that the absence of protest was proof of devotion. Their ignorance was protected by pride and social norms. To question their own behaviour would have meant admitting fault, something few were willing to do. Instead, they clung to the illusion of harmony while their wives withered in emotional isolation. Religion, too, played its part. Preachers praised modest wives who submitted without complaint, calling their obedience holy. Spiritual purity became entangled with physical denial. Women were told that their suffering was sacred, that to suppress their feelings was to elevate their souls. The result was a generation of women who believed that to feel was to sin, and to suffer quietly was divine. Over time, this silence seeped into everything. It defined how women walked, spoke, and even breathed. Their voices grew softer, their movements smaller. They smiled in public and wept in secret, trapped between expectation and reality. The culture that praised restraint also punished expression. To be human was dangerous, to be numb was safe. The cost of this repression was not only emotional but physical. Many women developed insomnia, trembling fits, and fainting spells, symptoms dismissed as hysteria but born from constant fear. The body kept the secrets the voice could not speak. Their hearts raced at every touch, not from excitement, but from panic, and still, society saw only their calm faces and tidy homes, proof of moral success built upon invisible suffering. In the end, silence became the greatest performance of all. It preserved reputations, upheld households, and destroyed the women who maintained them. Their stillness was not peace. It was surrender disguised as grace. The absence of sound became the sound of survival. The quiet obedience that once seemed virtuous revealed its cost in sleepless nights and broken spirits. The world outside saw serenity, but behind closed doors lived exhaustion and fear. And just as silence had smothered women's voices, another kind of silence was beginning to take hold, one enforced not by manners, but by medicine itself. The act often began before a woman's body was ready for it. There was no patience, no waiting for her to feel comfort or warmth. The moment the husband decided, the act was set in motion. His body moved by habit, not affection, guided by the belief that a wife's willingness was automatic. The lack of moisture turned every movement into friction. Pain followed where tenderness should have been, and what was meant to unite two people became a slow tearing of flesh. It is grimly ironic that in an age so obsessed with modesty, the body itself was forced to bleed to prove obedience. Foreplay was rarely understood or practiced. Desire in women was viewed as something shameful or non-existent. Men were taught that only they possessed true appetite. A woman's stillness was not seen as resistance, but as refinement. The less she responded, the more respectable she appeared. The result was a pattern of intimacy that ignored biology entirely. Dryness was taken as proof of virtue, not discomfort. When pain came, it was endured in silence, because to complain was to invite suspicion of impurity. The lack of preparation turned every touch into abrasion. Skin tore in small, invisible places, and the soreness lingered long after. Some women bled slightly after each encounter, staining the sheets they would later wash alone. Others developed infections that burned for days, leaving them feverish and unable to walk comfortably. Yet they rarely rested. Marital duty did not pause for recovery. If we compare this to today, it would be like being forced to run barefoot on broken glass and then told the wounds were proof of your devotion. The pain was never discussed. Men assumed it was normal, a minor inconvenience that women simply tolerated. The medical world echoed this belief. Doctors called it delicate discomfort, or blamed the female constitution for being overly sensitive. No one questioned the cause. The act was not about connection, but completion. Husbands performed it as an obligation, wives received it as fate. Love was replaced by rhythm, and intimacy became a task rather than a moment of understanding. The emotional distance matched the physical cruelty. Wives prepared for these encounters with dread. Some prayed beforehand, asking for strength or numbness. Others closed their eyes and waited for it to end. Tears often fell silently, absorbed by pillows that had already witnessed too much. The bed that should have been a place of warmth became an altar of endurance. I often think the real tragedy was not the pain itself, but the belief that such pain was acceptable, even expected. For many, recovery was impossible. The body healed slowly, only to be torn again the following night. Women learned to move carefully during the day, to sit in ways that eased the soreness between their legs. They applied cold cloths or herbs in secret, trying to soothe the damage. These small acts of care were done quietly, hidden from husbands who would never understand or care to ask. In their minds, what mattered was frequency, not comfort. A wife's suffering was invisible, her compliance taken as satisfaction. Some women lost the ability to feel anything at all. The nerves dulled, the body withdrew from sensation. Others began to associate touch with pain so deeply that they flinched at even casual contact. Over time, affection itself became unbearable. Marriage, in this sense, became a repetition of violation masked as duty. It eroded both body and spirit, leaving behind something hollow that still called itself love. The culture of repression turned every sign of female discomfort into moral judgment. If a woman bled or winced, it was said she was weak. If she expressed no pleasure, she was praised for modesty. The very symptoms of harm became badges of virtue. Men, unaware of their role in it, carried on proudly, convinced they were fulfilling both marital and moral responsibilities. The misunderstanding was complete, and no one dared to break it. Religion offered no relief. Clergymen spoke of marriage as sacred, of the wife's body as belonging to her husband. They quoted scripture to justify obedience, turning injury into holiness. To resist was to sin, and to suffer quietly was to serve. The teachings wrapped cruelty in sanctity, making it untouchable. Under such beliefs, compassion was not weakness, it was heresy. The walls of Victorian homes hid these small violence. They happened in silence, behind lace curtains and candlelight, to neighbours and friends. These couples looked respectable, their lives orderly and pure. No one imagined the truth that each embrace could draw blood, that each night left behind pain disguised as virtue. The irony was unbearable, a culture obsessed with propriety that allowed its women to bleed unseen. Over the years, these unspoken wounds shaped generations. Mothers passed their silence to daughters, teaching them endurance as though it were wisdom. They spoke of marriage as a responsibility, not joy. The idea that intimacy could involve comfort or consent was unthinkable. The cycle continued, built on ignorance and reinforced by shame. What happened in those beds was not passion, but repetition. Each encounter chipped away at the body and the spirit alike, until nothing was left but habit. To the outside world, they were proper couples. Inside, they were strangers trapped by ritual. Their lives moved forward in quiet agony, the pain buried under layers of respectability. The pattern of cold intimacy revealed the heart of Victorian morality, a world that valued control over compassion, appearance over truth. The act that should have joined two people instead divided them, one giving pain, the other giving silence. In that silence, something dark awaited, where medicine itself would soon turn the same cruelty into treatment. Doctors in the Victorian era often claimed to treat women's nervous disorders with their own hands. The complaints were vague but common: pain in the stomach, sleeplessness, sadness, or what they called hysteria. Women came to clinics desperate for relief, describing heaviness in the body, tension in the chest, and a feeling of restlessness they could not name. Physicians, most of them men, listened with polite detachment. Then they prescribed the same remedy to nearly all manual stimulation of the genitals until relief was achieved. It is astonishing how medicine, once called an act of control, a cure simply because it wore the mask of science. These procedures took place in ordinary offices lit by oil lamps, not secret chambers. The patient was asked to lie back, covered only by a cloth, while the doctor began what he believed to be therapy. The term hysteria covered almost any symptom that could not be explained: sadness, fatigue, irritability, even desire itself. Since doctors considered women incapable of sexual pleasure, they did not see their actions as indecent. The goal was to bring about what they called a hysterical paroxysm, a brief trembling that supposedly restored balance to the nervous system. What the patient experienced was never asked. The contradiction was enormous. Victorian morality condemned female sexuality in public, yet permitted its exploitation in private. So long as it was labelled treatment, doctors claimed authority, women surrendered modesty, and the body became a site of medical experiment rather than understanding. Many women reported feeling lighter afterward, unaware that their so-called illness was born not of disease but of repression. Their relief was physical, but the cause remained unspoken. If we compare this to today, it would be like a doctor prescribing intimacy to cure loneliness and calling it science. The practice grew rapidly. Clinics filled with women seeking help for ailments that no one else took seriously. For many, it was their first moment of release in years. The trembling that followed the doctor's touch was reinterpreted as proof of cure, not of arousal. Physicians congratulated themselves on their success, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to admit, that they were exploiting ignorance. The line between healing and violation blurred completely. What made this possible was the silence surrounding female desire. Society insisted that respectable women did not experience lust. Doctors echoed this belief, convinced that what they witnessed in their offices was purely a medical response. To them, it was no more scandalous than setting a bone or sewing a wound. They spoke of muscles, nerves, and fluids, not feelings. The clinical language hid the reality women were being touched without genuine consent, under the guise of care. Some women found the experience disturbing but felt powerless to object. A doctor's authority was absolute. Questioning his actions could mean ridicule or dismissal. Others returned willingly, ashamed of the need but unable to deny the temporary relief. It was a cycle sustained by ignorance, modesty, and desperation. The procedure became routine, a standard treatment listed in medical manuals across Europe and America. I find it unsettling that so much harm can be done by people who truly believe they are helping. Over time, doctors began to complain that the process was exhausting. The treatment required time, patience, and precision. Some sought mechanical assistance. Thus came the invention of the first electromechanical vibrator, marketed as a device to reduce the doctor's workload. Its purpose was the same: to bring about the therapeutic paroxysm more efficiently. The device hummed quietly in clinics, its presence considered respectable because it was a machine, not a man. The absurdity of the situation escaped nearly everyone. No one saw it as sexual, it was mechanical, and therefore moral. The deeper cruelty of this practice was its deception. Women seeking help were never told what was being done to them in emotional terms. Their pleasure, shame, or confusion was irrelevant. The medical establishment transformed human intimacy into a symptom to be managed. Behind each procedure lay the unspoken truth that female desire, when denied recognition, would always return disguised as illness. The treatment cured nothing. It only perpetuated misunderstanding. Religion and social codes contributed to the charade. Clergymen spoke against passion while physicians profited from it. The body became a battlefield between restraint and release, with women caught helpless in between. Their pain was never taken seriously unless it could be turned into profit or control. The more society suppressed their emotions, the more women sought medical permission to express them. And the doctors, proudly professional, became priests of a new kind of ritual. For upper-class women, these visits were discreet but frequent. A nervous condition became almost fashionable, proof of sensitivity and refinement. They left the clinic refreshed, reassured by the doctor's calm demeanour. Meanwhile, poorer women lacked even this pretense of care. Their suffering went untreated, dismissed as common fatigue. Only those with means could afford to have their repression packaged as therapy. As time passed, some voices began to question the ethics of the procedure. A few female doctors, rare at the time, criticized the practice as humiliation disguised as help, but their warnings were ignored. The men in charge refused to believe they could be doing harm. They saw themselves as guardians of health, never as participants in violation. The system continued until the 20th century, long after the world had begun to speak of freedom and progress. The so-called therapy reveals much about Victorian hypocrisy. A culture that preached purity invented a medical excuse to violate it. Women's bodies were controlled in every sense socially, sexually, scientifically. Their pleasure was treated as illness, their pain as evidence of weakness. What was sold as healing was, in truth, the quiet repetition of the same dominance that ruled their marriages and homes. Each visit to the clinic ended the same way: a sigh of relief, a word of reassurance, and the closing of a door. The doctor recorded success. The patient left subdued, and the cycle began again. To those outside, it was medicine. To those inside, it was something far more intimate and far more tragic. The illusion of care hid a profound misunderstanding of what it meant to be human. The so-called cure for hysteria was not a remedy at all, but a reflection of how deeply the era misunderstood women's bodies. What began as treatment became another form of exploitation cloaked in science. And soon, that same misunderstanding would reach beyond the clinic, taking root in the homes where medicine and morality shared the same bed. Animal fat was one of the most common substances in Victorian households. It was used for cooking, for polishing boots, for softening leather, and quietly, for the human body. When intimacy was uncomfortable, some women turned to what was available: mutton fat, horse fat, or even rendered snake oil were rubbed onto the skin as makeshift lubrication. It was a crude solution to a problem no one dared to name. It is darkly humorous that an era obsessed with propriety could tolerate smearing kitchen grease onto their own bodies in silence. The fat, when warmed by the body, melted into a slick layer that eased friction for a moment, but its texture was heavy and suffocating, clinging to the skin like wax. Afterward, It cooled into a residue that sealed pores and trapped sweat. The smell was distinct, sharp, and animal. Women washed as best they could with cold water and coarse soap, yet the odour lingered for days. Still, they repeated the ritual, believing it practical, harmless, and modest. Few realised that what they applied for comfort often led to infection, rash, or fever. There was no market for proper lubricants. The idea itself was unmentionable. To acknowledge discomfort in the marital bed would have been shameful. So, households used what they had. Mutton fat from the kitchen or the butcher's scrapings became the private medicine of modest wives. Some tried to improve it with herbs or perfume, thinking that the fragrance would hide the stench. It only made things worse. The oils mixed poorly, creating a sour, rancid smell that clung to fabric and skin alike. If we imagine this in today's world, it would be like using melted candle wax as lotion and calling it intimacy care. The mixture of heat, fat, and sweat created the perfect environment for bacteria. Small cuts became inflamed, and the thick coating blocked air from reaching the skin. Infections spread easily, often mistaken for mysterious feminine ailments. Doctors prescribed rest, tonics, or purgatives, never suspecting the true cause. Women were left to suffer through burning and swelling, too ashamed to describe what they had done. The practice was passed quietly between friends or servants, spoken of in whispers as something useful for difficult nights. Some went further, seeking stronger sensations. Old apothecaries sold stimulating ointments that claimed to restore passion. They contained mixtures of animal fat, alcohol, and scented oils. A few even used snake oil, believed to awaken the senses. The effect was immediate and painful, burning rather than arousing. Yet those who felt it thought the pain meant it was working. I cannot help but feel disturbed by how desperation turned ignorance into injury, and injury into routine. Behind this habit was a deep misunderstanding of the body. Victorian education did not teach women about their own anatomy. The female body was a mystery to its owner, something to be obeyed but never explored. When pain came, it was accepted as fate. When irritation followed, it was hidden. Cleanliness was measured by smell, not health, as long as the odour could be disguised with lavender or rose oil. The damage beneath did not matter. In wealthier homes, perfumed ointments were kept in small jars with silver lids. They looked refined, but their contents were no better than what poorer women used. The difference was only in presentation. A lady might keep such a jar beside her powders and combs, pretending it was merely a cosmetic cream. Her maid, who prepared the mixture, likely knew the truth but never spoke of it. The hypocrisy was complete, propriety above all, even at the cost of pain. Animal fat clung not only to skin but to memory. The sheets absorbed it, darkening over time, releasing faint odours when warmed again by the body. Some women scrubbed the stains with vinegar or lye, but the smell always returned. It became part of the atmosphere of the room, a constant reminder of habits that could not be named. The intimacy that should have felt human instead reeked of livestock and decay. No one questioned these customs because no one spoke of them. The male body was considered pure by virtue of authority. The female body was expected to endure quietly. If irritation or infection followed, it was a private matter. To ask for medical help would invite humiliation. Women treated themselves with the same substances that caused the problem, trapped in a cycle of harm mistaken for care. The silence was as thick as the grease itself. In time, reformers began to write about cleanliness and hygiene, but their advice rarely reached the bedroom. Manuals spoke of modesty, not health. They warned against indulgence, not disease. The act remained secret, shaped by discomfort and superstition. The fat, the pain, the smell, all were normalized, folded into the rhythm of married life. The use of animal fat as lubrication was more than a primitive habit. It was a reflection of everything the Victorian world refused to face: its ignorance of women's bodies, its fear of pleasure, and its worship of appearances. What should have been care became contamination, and what should have been shared became solitary suffering. The traces of these crude remedies lingered in every sense, on the body, in the air, in the quiet shame that followed. They were small acts of desperation, carried out in the name of modesty and love. Yet even as the body burned, society remained proud of its morality, blind to the harm that morality caused. The slick sheen of fat promised ease, but beneath it lay infection, isolation, and denial. The search for comfort would soon turn even darker, leading women to pour harsher substances into their own bodies in pursuit of a false purity. After intimacy, many Victorian women rushed to cleanse themselves, believing purity could be restored with the right mixture. They mixed vinegar, salt water, or even their own urine to wash away traces of sex. These homemade solutions were passed from one woman to another, whispered between friends, printed discreetly in pamphlets, and recommended as natural protection. The idea was simple but dangerous. They thought that harshness meant effectiveness, that pain meant cleanliness. It is grimly ironic that what was meant to wash away shame often ended up destroying the very body it tried to protect. The act of rinsing became a ritual, a basin, a cloth, and whatever liquid could be found were all it took. Vinegar burned the inner skin instantly, leaving behind a sting that lasted hours. Salt dried the tissues, causing cracks that bled slightly but went unnoticed in the dim light. Urine was believed to have purifying qualities, its warmth mistaken for healing. The sensations that followed, burning, itching, soreness, were endured silently. To speak of it would mean admitting to what had just taken place, and that was a greater shame. Medical understanding of the female body was shallow at best. The concept of hygiene was mixed with superstition. Women were told that cleanliness was not only physical but moral, that a good wife must erase any sign of passion from her body. Water alone was considered too gentle to do the job. It had to sting, to feel like punishment. In that pain, they believed virtue was restored. If we compare this to today, it would be like using bleach to wash your hands and calling it care. The result was predictable but cruel. The inner walls of the body, delicate and sensitive, could not withstand such abuse. Inflammation spread quickly, turning mild irritation into a deep infection. Some developed constant pain, others lost the ability to conceive. Doctors saw the symptoms but never traced them to the cause. They prescribed tonics or bed rest, unaware that their patients were quietly poisoning themselves in pursuit of purity. For many women, every act of intimacy was followed by pain, and every pain was blamed on weakness. The idea of self-purification was deeply tied to the moral codes of the time. The Victorian woman was taught to be clean in mind, body and spirit. To her, impurity was not only physical contact but the very idea of desire. So she cleansed herself of both, scrubbing away guilt as if it were dirt. The harsher the mixture, the more virtuous she felt. It was an act of control in a world that offered her none. Even as her body ached and burned, she believed she was doing what was right. In wealthier homes, porcelain basins and scented cloths replaced wooden buckets, but the practice remained the same. Perfumed vinegar was sold under delicate names like ladies' water, advertised as refined and medical. The rich could afford elegance, yet they suffered the same consequences. Their chambers smelled faintly of flowers and acid, an invisible reminder of the cost of propriety. No one questioned it, for the line between pain and virtue had already blurred beyond recognition. Women shared recipes the way others shared remedies for headaches or fevers. Some claimed that adding rosewater softened the sting. Others mixed in crushed herbs to balance the humours. Nothing worked. The burning persisted, the discomfort deepened, and infection spread silently. Still, they continued, convinced that discomfort was proof of moral success. Those who avoided the ritual were whispered about as careless or unclean. Shame was the most effective teacher of all. The tragedy of these practices was not only their physical harm, but their persistence. They lasted for decades, reinforced by ignorance and fear. Even when science began to question them, social norms refused to yield. Women had learned to equate purity with pain, obedience with health, and silence with dignity. Breaking that pattern required more than knowledge. It required unlearning an entire belief system. In the poorest districts, the ingredients were even harsher. Without access to vinegar or herbs, some used whatever liquid they could find, sometimes cold, stagnant water from public wells. The infections that followed spread through entire neighbourhoods, leaving women sick and infertile. They were scolded for neglecting hygiene, never realising they were victims of its misunderstanding. Doctors saw it as proof that the poor were careless, not that society had failed to educate them. The image of a woman bending over a basin, scrubbing away traces of her own body, captures everything cruel about Victorian morality. It was not cleanliness she sought, but absolution. In her mind, she was not tending to her body but to her soul. The sting was her penance, the pain her proof of virtue. And when the burning subsided into numbness, she felt clean again, unaware that the real damage was already done. The ritual of self-cleansing after intimacy was not about health, but control. It revealed how deeply the era had turned womanhood into a battleground of purity and shame. Each drop of vinegar, each grain of salt, each painful rinse was a confession performed in silence. The body became both sinner and sacrifice. The illusion of cleanliness hid the truth that the more they cleansed, the more they suffered. Each rinse left them weaker. Each night ended with the same ache. And still they returned to the basin as if salvation waited inside. The burning they mistook for virtue became the quiet echo of their submission. Yet something darker still waited beyond the pain, where the idea of purity would demand not just cleansing, but silence itself. In many Victorian slums, there were no beds to share, only the floor. The poor lived packed into small rooms where straw, dirt, and sweat mixed into a single surface. At night, when the day's exhaustion left no strength for thought, intimacy happened wherever there was space, on damp boards, on packed soil, sometimes beside the same fire used for cooking. It was not passion that brought people together there, but the simple instinct to feel alive for a moment in the middle of decay. It is bitterly ironic that love, in its most human form, was practiced in the same filth that bred disease. The floors were rarely clean. Rats scurried along the corners, leaving droppings in the straw. Cockroaches hid in cracks, crawling out when the lamps were blown out. Moisture from the walls soaked into the boards, feeding mould that never dried. The stench was constant, a blend of rot, urine, and smoke. When bodies pressed against that ground, their skin touched not warmth, but the residue of poverty itself. And yet, for many, it was the only place available. To deny the act was to deny connection. To perform it was to risk infection. The dirt was more than visible grime. It carried every kind of a life the city created and forgot. Fleas bit at the ankles, worms hid in the cracks, and the dust that floated in the air was laced with soot and waste. When skin met that surface, the smallest cuts became gateways for disease. Afterward, the itching began. Rashes spread quickly, especially on the thighs and genitals. The discomfort became part of daily existence, no longer shocking, simply another symptom of survival. If we imagine this in the modern world, it would be like sleeping on a subway floor and calling it home. The poor did not choose this out of neglect. It was a necessity. Beds cost money, and space was a luxury. Entire families shared single rooms, sometimes even single mattresses. Privacy was an idea reserved for the rich. Curtains or hung sheets served as walls, thin barriers that muffled nothing. In that environment, shame had no meaning. Intimacy was stripped of mystery and reduced to routine. It happened quietly, efficiently, often in darkness, before fatigue replaced desire.